But I'm a biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I study evolution mostly of Icelandic freshwater fishes. So I have a very aquatic slide in that sense to the material that I will present, which is obviously very relevant to the area, Mývatn. And so Mývatn is really a case study, and Iceland is in a sense a case study for biodiversity. But I'll mix in like sort of not maybe hardcore biological stuff, but with philosophical things. So I'm kind of in the sector of this multidisciplinary approach to like this course is all about. And just very quickly mentioning in the beginning that BIODICE is a network of people and institutions in Iceland which are concerned with biodiversity in a very broad sense. And I chair the board of this network, and I will introduce it very briefly at the end. But you can go into a website called biodice.is to learn more about it. So I just wanted to present you sort of with my worldview of nature, what nature is, and how I see things, and not just me. I think this is kind of a summary of maybe the theme of this presentation, and also of the theme of the things we need to think about. That nature is really all about relations, and diversity is the foundation of relations and processes in nature, because something is different or changes from something else. So it's a fundamental philosophical concept in that sense. And the second thing is that organisms, just like us, or birds or fish, are interwoven into the environment. It senses, experiences, shapes, and creates. So it has this kind of umwelt, like I'm sure Viðar has already mentioned Jakob von Uxkel to you, who had this concept of umwelt. That's why I'm using it here. But this is what ecology and biologists are really focusing on more and more today, is to think about how the organism is connected with its immediate environment through sensing in the very broad sense. And then we have to present this sort of humble view of humans being a part of all this in reality. And but of course, we are only aware in the sense and the direct sensing aware of this reality. We only have our umwelt, so to speak. So of course, this speaks against this sort of arrogant view that we are kind of dominant in nature and we are superior. I just throw that out the window right away. Just a spider is even more important in that sense for me than another human. If you see what I mean? So we have to think about this way. And also maybe to conclude that the reality we are aware of is a part of a vaster reality, which really makes us what we are. Nature makes us in a broad sense. And just to sort of take the message home about the connection of organisms and the environment, this is a seahorse, which is of course directly connected with its environment. Environment and the seahorse are the same thing, you can say. So this brings me to talk about biodiversity, and this slide has a lot of information, and I probably could just stop after all this, but just to sort of connect you with, because this is a huge topic in the world today. And so this definition here, that I'm not going to read for you, you can see it, is the official definition of the Convention of Biological Diversity from the United Nations. It's just quite a huge institute and a group of nations fighting to restore and fighting against biodiversity loss. And it's a very, very broad definition, but it's quite captivating because it does include diversity both between species, but also within species. And it also captivates the diversity of ecosystems. And ecosystems are systems that are connected with the inorganic environment. So we can say that by combining diversity of that relationship, we are bringing in nature really as a whole to this concept. And I could spend a long time just talking about definitions and that, but the main problem, as you will notice momentarily, is that people tend to focus on species. We are taught that species is kind of the unit of diversity, which is very problematic and a very static view that I will be sort of counteracting briefly. But I repeat what I said earlier, that diversity is the basis of any kind of relations and systems. So ecosystems, their function, resilience, and responsiveness, and their way of supporting life on Earth in general is based on diversity. So more diversity in that sense, for example, creates more resilience, more stability in ecosystems. and it provides more sources for humans or for other organisms. And we can also say that diversity in the broad sense is essential for processes of organismal development, which is sort of my field. I study development from eggs to adults, you see. So I think a lot about how organisms develop, but also how they evolve, and the interaction of development and evolution is quite remarkable in that sense. So this the take-home message here is really that without diversity, there are no choices. This is what Darwin recognized when he was thinking about diversity of life on Earth, that if there are no choices, there is nothing to select from. And the same goes with the development of human societies. You all know that how much we preciously look at diversity in societies. It's exactly the same thing. And without difference, there can be no change. So without diversity, there is no life. And many languages have concepts that actually say that being dead is not to have diversity. It's like, so, and finally, we are part of Earth's biodiversity. And we could spend a long time convincing people around us that we are not much different from other organisms. We share the same chemicals, we share the same emotions, we share the same needs for and habitat, for example, and food and mate and that sort of thing. But I draw your attention to two reports, recent reports from the United Nations on the issues. Here's a huge report on climate problems that I know you're talking a lot about, and I'm not going to go into that in any details. And here is a report from 2019 by this organization, EPBES. It summarizes dramatic information about loss of biodiversity on Earth, which is quite unfortunate, of course, and it comes from this human domination, we would say. But I just want to mention to you numbers. I mean, you can imagine that there are about 10 million species of organisms on Earth. 1 million of those are threatened of extinction, 1 million. And 30% more are at risk. Just think about it. 75% of areas on Earth are so much influenced from man that they have very serious consequences for habitats for organisms. 85% of freshwaters on Earth have been destroyed, basically, for organisms to live, through draining and various other uses. So it's important to think that this kind of system is valuable. Many other things in Iceland is are relatively untouched, and therefore, just through this kind of observation, clearly very valuable. Biomass of mammals on Earth has gone down by 85% since 1970. Just to think about this. Biomass, just the weight of all wild organisms, where humans and our farm animals have gained enormous amount of biomass. So this is maybe just to sort of bring the message home that there is a real biodiversity problem. And extinction rates now are 10 to 100 times higher than on average for the past 10 million years. So these are the kinds of numbers that come out of this report. And I know this sounds horrible, but we have to work with this situation now. And fortunately we can. And this course is all about that, in my opinion. So just to engage a little bit with what I mean by within species diversity, because Iceland's biodiversity, that I'll be coming to momentarily, is really all about that. It's really all about diversity within organisms because we have so few species on this isolated island. So these are various examples of within species diversity and how these African cichlids, these are famous Darwin's finches from Galapagos. These are actually killer whales, which also have these within species forms. And these are African finches from Cameroon. The interesting thing about this diversity here among these fish is that they are related, it's related to their environment. So if you look at the mouth shapes, the beak shapes, it's all about how they connect with the environment, what they're feeding on, what kind of habitat they're in. So already here we can say that an organism cannot be studied unless in complete context with its environment. That's what its diversity is all about. So needless to say, I'm sure you're aware of that we have had terrible problems fighting or reversing the biodiversity loss in the world. And how many of you are familiar with these Aichi goals? Have you ever heard of these? In 2010, the Convention of Biological Diversity had a huge conference. They have these COP meetings regularly. And they created these very, very ambitious goals for 2020 to fight and restore biodiversity on Earth. They basically all failed. And we couldn't get into a very strong political discussion on why they failed. It was simply, that we were obviously using the wrong approach. We were not changing our views to how we behave. Our notion of superiority and dominance and arrogance and capitalism and all that was just business as usual. And we unfortunately are quite a lot there still. But there was another COP meeting in Montreal last December. And this is what this one here, you can Google this. It's called for a real transformation in approaches. So, of course, people have been realizing, and these are no idiots working there, that we need a biological, social, economical, and philosophical transition in the way we basically live our lives. And a lot of the stuff that comes out of this has to do with issues of equity for resources, food security, and indigenous values, and things like that, and local values, just like Asta Christine was talking about here, local values. So, in a sense, it's a massive change to reconnect man as a natural being. That's the statement, and this is sort of reflecting what I had in my first slide. Fortunately, you can say, we can narrow this discussion down to this issue, that we need to change. And it can be difficult for many people to accept that this is most important, but I think that at least I have come to the conclusion that it's the most important thing, and many bodies of the United Nations agree with this. So, for example, there was a very interesting report in 2021 called "Making Peace with Nature," a scientific blueprint to tackle climate, biodiversity, and pollution emergencies. And it basically said in the introduction here, and this is the red thread through the whole report, that we need to transform our relationship with nature, not transform nature. So it was really fighting against this massive technological superiority behavior, and get down to business and behave like proper ethical beings in nature. And this is taken directly from the COP15 agreement from last December, that in 2050, it is actually stated there that people should live in harmony with Mother Earth. Now, for many people, that sounds like a very romantic feeling, but this is a serious statement there. And one can just say, well, are they totally crazy? Do they expect this really to be able to happen? But yes, they are. And many of the goals, there are about 24 goals, I think, that are supposed to be reached by 2030. And this is what we are now aiming for in the BIODICE network here in Iceland, to promote policy by the government and education and other things that help this to materialize. Now, I don't want to take you away from the idea that, of course, there are many technological advances and solutions that can be employed as well. And this is completely in line with the climate issues. The biodiversity and climate change are issues which are completely combined. Climate change is only one factor affecting biodiversity. Land use is another one, invasive species, pollution. Now, climate change is based on pollution. And because I kind of speak from the natural science world here, I want to draw your attention to that this view that I'm expressing is not my personal opinion alone. There are lots of people talking like this now, and many, many more than we're doing 5 years ago. And I'm very pleased to be able to say this from my area. I mean, I would consider this guy a colleague, an ecologist from France. He's one of the leading ecologists of the world, basically. This guy, really, really clever guy. I've never met him, actually. I don't know him very well personally, but he just published this book, and you can look at it. It's now published here in 2023. Notice
that in our lecture room.
Look at the title: Nature That Makes Us Human. And here's a hardcore natural scientist just sitting down. Okay, let's do something about this. And his first observation is, okay, we need to reconnect man with nature. Okay, how can we do that? He spends a chapter in the book talking about how organisms and man and other organisms are basically the same thing, just like I said in the beginning. And la 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 la. You see what I mean? So we are fortunate to see this change, that people are moving away from purely technological, mechanical thinking in science and into a little bit more deeper philosophical, ethical, social, and humanity-oriented behavior. And this is a leader of a very large European organization called European Molecular Biology Laboratories, Edith Hearth, that we actually in BIODICE, we work a lot with this institute. That's why I put this up here. See this opinion piece in Nature, the journal, just a few months ago. Molecular biologists, let's reconnect with nature. And I was fortunate enough to actually be in a meeting with these people in early May, where I gave a lecture a little bit like this one, oriented towards the scientists. And I thought I would be flogged afterwards, you know, like, but they, okay, we agree with this. They said that. I said, yes, let's go for it. So now I'm just going to give you, and this will be brief, and you will have to bear with me with maybe technical words and terms that will come up, but because I'm actually now using a few slides that came from this meeting, you know, where I was speaking to the scientists. So focusing on the biologists, like what are our responsibilities for this problem? Why weren't the IEC goals reached? What is the reason for this? Aside from, you know, all these other things, politics and economic issues and basically ignorant behavior that many of us show, is that the biological approaches to biodiversity, they have been weak. They have been using static measures of biodiversity, such as species richness, which is a very big concept in biodiversity world, which is largely meaningless when it comes to the broader issues of what biodiversity really is, as you already saw. And also there's a very, very strong focus on genetics, which is problematic. Not that genetics are unimportant, but there is a very strong focus on genes and genetic variation, whereas the variation among populations, the variation among us as we look, is often overlooked more. So this is really calling for what I would say more dynamic process of biodiversity. And now I'm also bringing in our philosophy of the work that we're doing gradually. And this is reflected in reports and suggestions and policies, both global and local, worldwide. It actually is this view that we need to think more dynamically about biodiversity, and we need to think more about what we can call nature-based approaches to conservation and restoration. But we are not the makers of nature. We need to work with nature, in nature. That's what nature-based is referring to. Because ecosystems, they have a life of their own, just like we have a life of our own. There's something going on in our bodies that makes us what we are. I don't know what's happening in my legs right now when I lift them, you see, but there's a lot of things going on here. But that's what I mean, is that that's a nature-based process. We can leave an ecosystem intact, and we have very great examples of this in Iceland, and it will flourish just if it is let alone, given the opportunity to become what it can become based on the conditions that are available. You've seen a complete wasted sand in the southeast of Iceland, where Þorri will show you in south of Vatnajökull, an area which has become a woodland. 100 years ago, it was just bare sand. Humans did not do anything there. Of course, we can step in and assist and so forth. We are part of this, but we should not imagine that we should be doing the whole thing. So the technicality maybe comes in here, that the kind of biology that we are connecting here is ecology, ecological systems, and evolutionary biology. How does biodiversity evolve based on the connection with ecology? And how does development of the individual, that is the variation among us and other organisms in the world, what role does that have to play in this kind of dynamic understanding? And in the conference that I mentioned, I threw out a lot of examples of papers that have come out maybe just in the last 5 years about how these kinds of biologists are now pumping out information, like about how climate change is affecting the hormonal function of species, and they are now reproducing in the wrong time of the year, and they go extinct. It's all sorts of these details that are now floating out from this biology crowd, fortunately, and it just needs to be applied. It hasn't really been applied very much. And And so how do we do this? And here it's like a kind of a bit dramatic statement in the beginning here, but I presented you with this view of relational view. This also is the foundation of the process view that I'll be presenting more in a moment of nature. I'm obviously doing this to lead you out of this idea of that nature is static. Of course, you all believe, you understand that nature is not static. I mean, it's moving, obviously. That we need to think about what kind of movement is this? What kind of flow is this? What kind of process are we looking at? So what we do here, for example, in this framework that we've created here in Iceland and published in this paper, actually, there, we combine sort of an ecological, evolutionary and developmental approach through these arrows. And I'm not going to burden you with any details of this, but it is a dynamic view of how biodiversity like this is actually created and maintained. And it can all start here with the Devo part, because the developmental part results in how a population, let's say of 25 or 100 individuals, I'll be talking about small charr in a cave close to here in a moment. They may have 100 individuals. It's a completely separate population, isolated population, evolving on its own terms in this cave. And but each individual develops, and each individual develops to become slightly different from the other. So we have variation in the population. And that is what we call phenotypic variation. Like phenotype is like our noses and hair color, and phenotype is the expression of the organism. And behavior is also a phenotype. But we can take that phenotypic variation is drawn through evolution across generations by natural selection because of the ecological conditions that these organisms find themselves in and are intrinsically connected with. Okay, so when that has happened across generations, you will have heritable effects transmitted to the next generation of the population. That's natural selection in action, Darwinian kind of evolution. So that the next generation will be slightly different because there are some of not going to survive, others are going to survive. And here we have both genetic messages, but also what's called epigenetic messages, and also sort of non-genetic inheritance, which is now becoming also very highly recognized. And maybe just to throw in then a couple of complicated parts, but essential for the kind of philosophical basis of this approach, is that that the ecology also has effects directly within generations. So that's what's called plasticity, phenotypic plasticity. It's a diet or temperature can influence how the individuals develop. And now through advances in genetics, this has become very well developed. And research on cancer and diseases is really helpful here. But this plays a lot of role in Iceland because we have such plastic organisms here. And then maybe the plot concludes when we point to the arrows. What are these arrows doing? They are saying that the organisms, they also make their environment. Notice, there are two arrows feeding back to the ecology, saying that we are intrinsically, just like the seahorse, connected both through evolution and development with the environment. And the humans, of course, we are influencing our environment at the most, and unfortunately, often in a very destructive way. So that was just a little brief introduction of this framework, because it can help to orientate you to some of the things I'm going to say later. I'll be coming back to Iceland in a while, show you some pictures of fish and stuff like that. This is a background. So we also just need to familiarize us with that. Okay, I've already said that difference and diversity is the foundation of any kind of relations, and in fact, any kind of living systems. And then we really need to realize that these systems are hierarchical. They are working all the way down to the very small molecular situations in our bodies, up to the cellular. I mean, we have trillions of cells in our body, and we have trillions of bacteria and viruses and fungi helping us to work. So we are completely symbiotic in that sense. Organismal community, ecosystem, even global ecosystem. So biological systems really need to take into account these different hierarchy of systems. That doesn't sound very simple, but it is amazing that when you dive into these systems, you can apply the same kind of thinking about how they operate, because things relate in a similar way, even within cells, as they would do in an environment like the Mývatn. And for those that are really interested in this kind of philosophy, because it is very important, is that difference in that sense is not just important for relations in themselves, but it is important for relations in systems can contain. Relations in systems contain information. They can contain what Gregory Bateson, that I'm citing there, called a mind. He talked about mind in nature. And I mean, we could talk about artificial intelligence here and everything, but systems do contain information and messages and meaning of things. That would be a subject of a whole nother lecture to really take that on. But just to put this into the context of how we are maybe looking at this in our human worlds, is that we can say that properties of living systems can be examined in a number of ways. And here we can maybe say is a suggestion of a way that is dominant. And I'm sure Vidar has already talked quite a bit about this and the scientific revolution, how it separated man from nature and how it created this idea of nature being a machine and all that. We, of course, are living in a world where 98% of everybody believes that we should be looking at nature like a machine. We are taught that way, unfortunately. And it helps a lot. You know, if you're a doctor researching cancer or something, it's very helpful to think that the body is a machine. And you can find the medical that affects this gene here, but you have no idea what you're really doing. But it does work, and that's okay. See, I'm not speaking against that. So, but the problem is that it has an underlying notion that there is a directive, somehow genetic blueprints, something, everything is predetermined somehow. It's a philosophical problem. It has been fighting humanity for many centuries. There's a primary structure on units, that the units are having some kind of causal relationships, endless causal relationships in networks. What actually happens in the networks between things is more or less ignored. As you say, inherent properties of relations are often ignored. That is to say, for example, this information storage that I talked about tends to be kind of thinned out in some discussion about causality. It then becomes completely impossible to interpret because causalities are just everywhere if we think that way. But there is a creative element of these relations. And maybe most importantly is that the environment as a concept is completely external. And that affects the way we do science, because scientists then become external observers. They stand beside this. And remember what Edith Hurt said, molecular biologists need to reconnect with science. So when I had this slide up in the meeting, I said, that's what Edith Hurt actually means. She was sitting in the front row, so that was quite, she nodded her head actually, and I was quite pleased with that. In a process view of life, like I'm presenting here, this is the other view, so to speak. Obviously, I'm contrasting these. The scientist is a part of nature. So in a process view of this kind, which I call a process model of expecting, whereas I call the other one a process model of predicting. What is the difference? What's the difference of predicting and expecting? Sorry, I'm speaking very fast about this, but I would have liked to maybe spend more time on exactly this type of thing, but I want to get to the biology. So in this kind of model, the scientist is actually a part of the system. There are very beautiful examples of this in the scientific world, actually, like in the sort of history of science. But here the primacy is on living processes based on the system's relations in themselves. And so there is an emphasis on the creativity of the system, based on these, you can call it information or knowledge or mind or whatever. But I'm just throwing at you words that come out of this, is that it brings in concepts like self-creation, autopoiesis, co-development, which is a very biological term, symbiopoiesis, that the development of a multicellular organism, so with all the help of bacteria and stuff, is now called symbiopoietic. It's actually Donna Haraway, if some of you know her name, and she came up with this concept. And finally, agency. that there is some kind of agency in the system. In fact, thinking. So, for example, when I say that through the eco-evo model that I showed you, that sometimes the environment is affecting the development of the individual directly within generations. For example, if a fish eats certain things, its development changes so that it is better at eating it. See what I mean? It's a very adaptive process that occurs here. The system is responding in a positive way. Now, it's not the mind of the organism, it's the system itself that is responding in a meaningful way. This is sometimes very difficult for natural scientists to understand or accept or get familiarize themselves with a language like this. But I hope I'm getting the message across. So these are citations that I'm not going to dwell with to real, let's say, biologists that are writing about these things, is that they see that it is actually impossible to consider adaptations of organisms to the environment unless you just decide they are interconnected completely. So it's not about the environment and the organism being here. No, it's like this. And this is often, we can call it, it's like a transaction. It's not interaction, it's transaction. And I remind you of the seahorse again.
What's the difference between interaction and transaction? Transaction sounds a little.
Transaction really is referring to that it is what happens between things that are interacting. Interaction is giving primacy to the units themselves that are interacting. That's my simplest way of saying it. There is a book, little book by WII, that is the transaction. I think it starts with self-action, interaction, and transaction. And so in the self-action, it's the idea, like we say that genes do this and that, sometimes that's like self-action. This is kind of meaningless. Interaction, on the other hand, is creating some dynamics. And transaction is then somehow leaving and just putting yourself in the relationship as it is.
I think there's a different definition when you're talking politics or
Yeah.
culture.
I'm sure.
So that's good to know that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank
But that's very, very helpful comment because there are concept issues here for sure. And so the conclusion of this is really that we really should be looking at nature as an innovative process of co-creation. That's the conclusion here. And because I've been making the statements that this is a process view of life, and I just had to throw in a citation to the most sort of famous process philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who actually is the person in early 20th century that stimulated biologists to think this way. And his ideas were he's a mathematician actually by training and philosopher. And he got a lot of his ideas from Darwin, the idea of organic evolution. And in those days, as we do today, people were fighting viciously against machine view of the world. So, and in many ways, unfortunately, some of Darwin's ideas and how people abused them, if you take, what I mean by that, like eugenics and human breeding and extermination of certain breeds and things like that. They were all based on ideas that people thought came from Darwin. And so people like him really had to stand up and say, no, please, let's move back to reality here. Let's move back to the morality of things. Anyway, so I just like that citation. Everything is connected. Okay, so that's my switch. So now you can take a deep breath. So why would an introduction like this fit saying this, that Iceland is a case study? The short answer is that everything in Iceland is happening very quickly. Iceland is a very, very young island geologically. It was geographically isolated until 10,000 years ago because you had the ice caps here until 10,000 years ago. And that ice cap basically wiped out almost all life in Iceland. This is typical of areas above the 50th degree latitude in North America and Europe as well. So what the reason for and because it's isolated in the middle of nowhere and was so young, very few species have been able to colonize the island, really. For example, because I'm talking about fish momentarily, freshwater fish, we have only 5 species of freshwater fish in Iceland, whereas in Scandinavia there are about 50. In Canada there are 180. So it's a huge difference, and this actually cuts across all biota in Iceland. Even on the continental shelf, we do have fewer species than you would find on the continental shelf of Norway. But Iceland, because of its volcanic and tectonic nature, has extremely prolific habitats and environments for organisms. So having such little competition for evolving to these habitats, the species that have arrived here have had a wonderful time diversifying. That's exactly what Darwin discovered in Galapagos. Galapagos are volcanic islands, mind you. So sometimes we call Iceland actually just sort of arrogantly the Galapagos of the North. We also use the term theater of evolution. That's just another jargon. But there's a lot of other things about Iceland that I won't go into, the nature that is important for this diversity. For example, the nature of the ocean currents around Iceland, the glacier land and ocean connections, which are extremely dynamic and create enormous opportunities for ecosystems to develop. And you will see all this when you go to the Vatnajökull area directly. Of course, we do have a lot of new areas now coming from glacier thawing. It is a wonderful opportunity to study colonization of life. So, in a nutshell, it's a rapid diversification within species in response to ecological opportunities. You remember the picture I had before of these fish and killer whales and things that basically we are seeing these things happening in Icelandic organisms. But just to bring the connection with Whitehead and this what I called organic thinking of living systems, as combined with habitats, I use this citation to our colleague here, Viðar, and this is a philosopher that works with us at the museum, Ole Martin Sandberg. You can actually find this presentation on what's called the Rocks Project homepage. Viðar can help you with that. Viðar gave another talk there, and I gave a talk. These are all online, by the way. We talk about these things there. So he said basically that Iceland is not a thing, it's a process, a constantly becoming entanglement of interacting difference. Nothing is static, everything changes. It's perfect for processing. And here is a photograph I took actually from Askja. Askja was mentioned here before by Ásta Kristín. If you haven't been there you should go there at some point in your lives. So when I talk about habitat diversity, I'm being selective here of freshwater habitats. They are extremely diverse because of the tectonism. These are different lakes. This is Mývatn area. Here we have cave systems in Mývatn. We also have glacial lagoons, just to give you a feeling for the diversity. And this kind of diversity is also in the terrestrial environment. So because of the sheer isolation of these very few species that have arrived here, many of them have shown all sorts of local evolutionary patterns. They become different. You may remember, for example, that on many islands you have evolution of giant things like wingless birds and things like that. And humans were very busy exterminating this very early on in centuries. By the way, human problems with nature did not start with the Industrial Revolution. They were there before. We just were much more efficient after the revolution. So this has to do with this wren. I have a hard time remembering English names of birds. The eagle, the seals, this grass. They are all showing local characteristics in Iceland. And this is a very famous creature. It's like a 1 to 2 centimeter long crab, amphipod, blind and colorless, that lives in the groundwaters of Iceland. And it actually is the only organism completely proven to have survived ice ages. So it's the oldest Icelander. I love him a lot. But I'm going to bring in stories about this guy, which is about 10 to 12 centimeter little Arctic charr fish, which is living in the cave. This picture is from a cave, a walking distance from here, actually. So talking about these local adaptations, a colleague of mine, Bjarni Kristjánsson, PhD student, he did a study of these kinds of dwarf fish charr. Arctic charr is a salmonid fish, usually much bigger. Most people think of it as similar to salmon or something, or trout, but they come in all sorts of forms. And what he did find, and I'm gonna go quickly through this, is that there were repeated adaptations across the tectonic zone of Iceland in 31 locations. The little red dots that you don't see here, they're all on the volcanic ridge where we have ample amount of groundwater coming out. And the interesting thing about these creatures, which is the reason for the showing you this, is that they are locally evolved in each case. Because we have such beautiful genetic techniques to calculate relationships, relatedness of things, we can verify this by comparing the genetic relationships with reference populations in areas. So a dwarf charr like this that evolved in North Iceland looks very similar to another one that evolved in South Iceland, but they evolved independently. It's like the seahorse in the environment. They became what they are in their environment. That's the strength of the message. So it's what we call in biology parallel evolution. And it is one of the demonstrations that natural selection is actually scientifically real. But the more complicated version of this is not local evolution of individual species or populations, but we also have this diversification within species, like even formation of new species. And we do see this in Arctic charr, and I'll show you examples of that in a moment. The story about the cave charr around here will relate to that. We do see it in the Arctic fox, which is the only endemic mammal in Iceland, by the way. We don't have any rats and mice and things like that are introduced. A reindeer. We have it in these oyster catcher birds. We do see it in land snails, and we do see population formation of this kind in the Atlantic cod around Iceland. That is to say, we have diversification, populations adapting to different environments that are available because of the little competition there is for these resources. And you also see it in birds, the tree, which is the only really not only, but it is one of the few native trees in Iceland. And it does have very different morphs or populations or varieties in different parts of Iceland. But this has most been studied in fish. So these are examples actually of northern freshwater fish. These are the Arctic charr of Mývatn, Iceland. I'll show you a little bit more about in a moment. But we also see this kind of diversification in other species. This is actually from Sweden. This is from northern Norway. And these are stickleback from Canada that are showing very different local adaptations, adapting to different resources in lakes, mostly adaptations to the bottom or the open water. And we actually do see this in this lake. We have two varieties of charr in this lake called cruise, Icelandic. It's a benthic, bit ugly looking fish feeding on the bottom. It's very common around here. And then we have a much larger charr, which is more feeding out in the open water. And they look very different. And they have adapted to these different situations because there's hardly any competition for them. So in the evolutionary terms, we can throw up a model of this kind by simply comparing the sort of stages of divergence of these fish, these Arctic charr, across different lakes in Iceland. So this is what my research and my colleagues has been really all about, is to study a model of this kind, which we can basically say is about speciation. How are species formed? What is involved in that? And as you have noticed, the resources that these organisms are adapting to are critical here. And this is the largest lake in Iceland, in Þingvellir, which is, of course, for Icelanders, the most very important place, because this is where we have the Althing and everything. But it's a deep lake with very, very good habitats for fish, but there are only 3 species of fish in the lake. And Arctic charr has made use of it in the last 10,000 years and become highly differentiated. So these are benthic varieties. This is actually a fish-eating variety, and this one is an open water variety that feeds out in the open water on little crustaceans. I know I'm jumping rapidly, but I'm just giving you the feeling for this diversity. And they look different, they grow differently, they behave differently. These are adult sizes, by the way. And we know that a large component of this is based on inherited differences of some sort. So they are definitely locally formed. We know that too. But the message for biodiversity, and bringing back to the definition, is that we here have this situation in the lake. The pie diagrams are showing what they're feeding on, which is critical for how they have evolved. And so they are basically controlling what you can say, the ecosystem of this lake. They are having great effects. This diversification is really responsible for the ecosystem function here. And this is what has been so much ignored by the static view that I was criticizing. So, but we have a paper from like a summary paper summarizing numbers of studies that have looked at this within species kind of diversification, which I said has been so much ignored, and found out that ecosystem function is actually based at least equally importantly on within species diversity of this kind as is among species diversity. So when you're trying to convince the static biologist, you try to show him a graph like this. This is actually a very, very good study. And I'm just gonna remind you that this is where we work with this. Here we can say we have tried to explain how this happens through a framework of this kind. And I did mention plasticity, and well, plasticity is the eco-devo part of this, remember? The effect within generations. Here we have examples of very adaptive effects of the environment on phenotypes in these organisms, and we already have this information about the small charr. So when we feed them benthic diet, they look different than when we feed them open water diet. Mm-hmm. So we are trying to get an understanding of these different arrows, if you like, in this model. So finally, we get to Mývatn, but everything I've said has implicitly or explicitly been referring to this area, one way or the other, because it's not only a subset of a phenomenal case study for ecology and evolution in the broad sense, also considering the local cultures and everything that you're learning about in this course. But it's much more, it really stands out as an example in Iceland for those reasons. And also because we have this research station that Asta Kristín mentioned, and my group in Hólar University and University of Iceland, we've been working very closely with people at this research institute for many, many years, mostly studying the fish. So Mývatn is here, and as you have learned probably already, is that it is fed by groundwater, almost completely coming from Vatnajökull area through the volcanic northeast highlands. And shallow lake, extremely productive because this water is loaded with phosphorus. This is a very critical mineral for primary production to occur. The lake is shallow, as was mentioned, so sunlight can reach the bottom, and there's an enormous amount of primary production here. And so but the ecosystem is also very, very unstable. It's very dynamic. So slightly different from a deeper lake like Þingvallavatn that I showed you. So we can say that Mývatn is really a laboratory for biodiversity studies. And like I said, I can share these slides with you, and you can look more closely at the details. I deliberately kept in quite a lot of details in the slides that will come now. So I'm getting to the closing this with this Mývatn example. I'll tell you a little bit about the research we've been doing to bring the message home. That Mývatn is split into these two basins, the north basin and the south basin. The north basin is much deeper, but it is also highly influenced by, unfortunately, by mining that was done here for a while. And I'm sure you've heard about that. It was unbelievable. Other people did this actually. It was quite reflecting, a view of nature which was very, very human dominant. Let's put it that way. It had very destructive effects on the lake, unfortunately, mostly by bringing sediments into big holes that were created by the mining. That's one reason why the algae Quadrophora disappeared. Okay, so we of course have like 18 species of ducks or something, but the fish in the lake is mostly stickleback. It's actually this little fish called threespine stickleback, Gasterosteus aculeatus. It's a dominant fish species in the lake. There's enormous amount of invertebrates, both crabs, both benthic and more open water little crustaceans. We have enormous amount of flies, as you've noticed, and most of them are chironomids. It's our midges, we call them midges, and they are non-biting, but there are many species in the lake. One of them is endemic actually, and they have these huge emerging clouds coming out in certain parts of the year. But the biting insect is in the river that flows out in Black Salt, because black flies need running water to breed. So that was a kind of an overview of Mývatn, and I just threw in, you can't see it here really, it's a very old Icelandic way of looking at the food web of Mývatn. But what I want to draw your attention to as an example, and it relates to our studies, is that 2,300 years ago, when this lava flowed that you're standing on, only 2,300 years ago, 2,300 years ago, it flowed over a wetland, and it really created the lake as it is today. But it did more than that. It was a huge lava flow, and it flowed over wetland, and when that happens, the steam underneath is so great that it creates not only the pseudocraters that you see around here, but also it basically creates an open area under the lava. So in numerous places, hundreds of places, after the lava solidified, there were collapses. So there were these collapses of the roof and openings into this area. You realize what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in these little caves, they're mostly small. Some of them are very tiny. Others are much bigger, like this one. There is water. There is groundwater. There is very little connection between these caves, but there is some. So what people here knew for centuries is that in these caves, they had these little beautiful fish. This actually happens to be a drawing of an artist from Canada. Really, really beautiful drawing. And I also want to just use the opportunity to draw your attention to the book by Unnur Jökulsdóttir on the nature of Mývatn that has just been published in English. This is,
the supermarket.
there is a section in there about the local kind of history of this fish, and it's called Gjáarlanta in Icelandic, but we call them cave charr or small charr in caves. And here you have an aerial photograph. This is actually taken of the Haganes area. It is just out here to our left. And if we had planned it that way, we could have gone there and gone into and looked at this directly. And you will see these caves when you look around. So we've been studying two areas with caves, Vindbelgur area and Haganes area. And I remind you that in the lake itself, there are these large morph, remember, and this cruise morph that are already diversifying. But I can now state, based on our findings, that in these hundreds of caves, there actually are local populations. That's the remarkable thing. And don't worry about these details. It's just to convince you that you're doing real science, that they're measuring something. And that in these caves, we have something from 30 fish to about 300. We are studying about 20 caves. And this study has now been going on for 13 years. We have data sets, and the fish are not killed, they're anesthetized when they're caught, and they're caught by electricity and traps. We actually, when we're studying their diet, we actually pump the diet out of their stomachs. We don't kill them, you see. And we take little subsample of a fin for genetic studies, and maybe I should now go to the next slide, because it shows the scientists. And remember the process view? I talk about the umwelt of the cave chair and the scientists. Here we are together doing things together. And these are people in horrible situation with black flies, actually. And this is the notebook. And here is somebody in the cave itself. This is actually Camilo Blanc, who is a professor at our university. She is the head of this research project. They will be coming here in a week to do this project, or we will be coming. And here is a picture again of this big cave, which is close to here. And so what we've shown basically is that they all look different, slightly different. So each of them is photographed, you noticed, and we do digitize the images and we calculate their body shape based on what they feed. And we also do the very sophisticated genetic analysis. And it has basically shown that there are like 4 clusters around the lake of these. So evolutionarily speaking, some fish from the lake got into these caves probably very soon after the lava solidified. That's an idea. And then they got kind of isolated in certain areas when the caves became isolated. So these pie charts that show different colors, you can see that there's similar colors here in each place. They say that these are the different groups. And they are all directly related genetically to the groups in the lake. So it shows you that all this is happening locally. So we hope to have funding to continue this research to really do evolutionary studies in the wild. It's our, when you go into the details of how we work with restoring biodiversity on Earth, for example, monitoring is critical. You need to understand how things, like whether your ideas of restoring ecosystems actually work. And that you have to do that through monitoring and modeling and things like that. And just to also be a bit fancy here, you know, this is a typical way of presenting variation among the caves in terms of their morphology, their shape, their body shape. So it shows that there's a lot of variation in body shape of these small fish among the caves. And if you look more closely at these body shapes, they are in line with the resources that would be available in each cave. That's a bit of an overstatement. We don't have full evidence for this. And then finally, or do you have any questions about this? Is this case?
Yes, I have a question. I'm not sitting in the audience. I'm online here. Can I ask you a question? It's Catherine Ingram.
Yep, please.
Okay. Before this is all fantastic, of course, and fascinating. And I'm sorry to miss the actual walking around on the lake, although we've been seeing it as we've been moving around the area. I would like to go back just for a second to your mention of the Umwelt and the Uxkhöl and also Bateson and Whitehead and so forth. And I guess Maturana Varela, who did the autopoietic system and so forth. There was something that's always bothered me about that. I'm pretty familiar with it, but it had to do with what Uxkhöl tried to explain how variation inside the species in exactly the mode that you're talking about crosses over, of course, in evolution, you know, it crosses over to other species in some way. But he was talking about the fly and the spider, for example, how the spider communicates with the fly is not direct or in any way. It's about, you know, preparing the web just very specifically for the fly and the fly not being able to see it, that crossing over the species. So I've always been perplexed about, and I know how he talks about that, but I've never been totally persuaded that he had the right answer. But could you tell me about the cross communication? Because in Maturana Varela, the organism not only is influenced by the environment, it's shaped by the environment, but it also constructs the environment, right, to some degree. By making choices, selections, just as Bateson said, you know, the difference that makes a difference. So I'm curious about how these separate entities and separate cognitive systems and so forth, how do they cross over to each other in sort of not a communication may be the wrong word, but just very curious about that.
I know this. Thank you very much for this. This was a perfect input. And And I only want to make a relatively straightforward comment or reply, which is to think
Okay.
of the system. It is to think of all these things are being interconnected in a system where information is being shared. And I'm using the term information deliberately, but these information are based on sensing and interpreting. So what maybe Uxkel did not do with the sort of area of biosemiotics, I actually haven't mentioned that specifically, but the idea of another organism interpreting messages that it is receiving from the other, like the spider and the fly. I know I may be taking this out of context for you, but in a sense that is, then the spider is the environment of the fly. You see what I mean? And
yeah, I do.
the meaning of the situation that arises and becomes interpretable and useful for the adaptation of this creature or this system is kept in this relationship and how it is interpreted. And this,
Yes.
biologists are so much criticized for today, is to leave the concept of interpretation out of the picture.
Yes. Is that Luhmann? It's not Luhmann who took it into the societal communicative thing. That's not what you're saying.
Not
It's
but I'm referring very much to the work of Jesper Hofmeyr here.
yeah.
Jesper Hofmeyr, and then but if you take an example of this, which has been quite much published, is the idea of communication among trees, for example, and the symbiosis in forests. Like there's a Canadian scientist, is that Seth? Susan Zimmerman. Susan Simard, who wrote a great book about this. And
about the fungus and the trees.
The new data that is piling up now about microorganisms.
Yeah, microorganisms. Thank you. That's helpful. In the interpretation, the sensing and the interpretation of the other species, and the maybe it's also both that the environment allows those species to engage with each other in a variety of ways.
Absolutely. And I want to draw your attention, or maybe you're listening, I hope also, that to an author called Wendy Wheeler, who's actually an English literature person. She just died recently, but she wrote a book that I highly recommend called Expecting the Earth. And she's using this biosemiotic. And that's where I got fond of the concept of expecting rather than predicting.
Thank you.
Living in a world that is moving, you expect things. You're not predicting everything. You don't live in models. You live in what comes towards you. The flow.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. And okay. Thank you.
No problem. Great to talk to you. And this is another project. It's much bigger than this cave shell project. And it would take me an hour to get through that, but what we've been doing is studying this highly dynamic population of sticklebacks in the lake. Remember the little fish? They only grow about this big. They show enormous fluctuations in this lake. And when you have a situation like this, now I'm also getting into the research that Arne Einarsson and his colleagues that you didn't meet are actually doing with the midges in the lake, because there is a relationship there. So the ecosystem here is incredibly, let's say, it's a major opportunity to understand how these kinds of fluctuations actually occur. So we are and also the stickleback, they show diversification in one generation and then they collapse together again. So here, if we can understand what's really going on, it will give us insights into the nature of the dynamics. It's the same thing that in many ways people are doing in the Galapagos with the finches, because when there's El Nino, for example, in that area, they have plenty of things to eat, and then they hybridize the birds. And then when El Nino goes away, they start to separate, because then there is more competition. So anyway, so we are basically doing a lot of work, including, these are all strange terms like mesocosm and laboratory. Mesocosms means doing experiments in the natural condition. This is the big, when Edith Hurd said, let's bring us into nature again. She's saying, let's do experiments in nature. let's try to understand the environment in its entirety. Not try to imagine that we can control the environment. It's the most stupid thing you can imagine. What you have no idea what the organism is sensing. So what if you think it's sensing the temperature or the light that you sense, and you control that, you're only controlling it for you, not the fish. See what I mean? So still, I guess we're also just trying to sort of demonstrate that this kind of framework can actually, and we are very glad to see that it seems to be. This was a huge number of people have been working on this, students and postdocs, a very international project. But this is my last slide, just to illustrate, to advertise the BIODICE project. And this year we are actually, the BIODICE network we're running a biodiversity festival in Iceland. We are doing everything we can to raise awareness. And this, for example, in April, Viðar and I at a symposium in Reykjavik on the kind of humanity multidisciplinary approach to understanding biodiversity. It was a wonderful experience, just to mention that. And so we are having, so we use this kind of approach. We are of course promoting research on biodiversity, but also transferring the knowledge to education and policy and helping the government to do something about this. Because we have actually signed an agreement which is about biodiversity, which is so ambitious that it's amazing that we didn't put billions of kroner into it right at Christmas time, but we are still trying to push it down. And just this book here actually just got published that you might also be interested to look at. This Loro, I can't pronounce this properly, of course. He is one of the editors of this book, and it is a very nice summary and guidelines for policy making in terms of restoring biodiversity. Of course, everybody has his or her own ideas of what is best, but this kind of book does summarize the opportunities and the methodologies. So I want to say that there is a huge shift towards a positive change and transformation, in my opinion. And we are capable of things. And I know it's a cliche to say this, but we were able to fight COVID. We were able to put a man on the moon and so forth. So this is just a piece of cake. Here's the algae.
I'm curious, with the required, what you noted is the required shift in people, thinking of humans as superior towards seeing their role in natural systems and processes in a different way. I guess for people that are not, I guess, in rooms like this and, already engaging with talks and thinking about biodiversity and ecosystems, what sorts of experiences or ways of reaching people do you think could be most effective to bring people into these more expanded ways of thinking about natural systems and relationships?
Yeah, but thank you for this. I mean, this is the $1 million question, really. Like, how do we actually do this? And I mean, our idea, experience, for example, just to start there with this biodiversity festival, is simply to just talk about it, just bring it out, write about it in the newspapers, have meetings, and maybe most importantly, when you have the opportunity to go into nature, to do things there, to bring people into a situation like this. This is an ideal situation, of course. Now, if I had been giving, like, say, a full-scale five lectures or something, one lecture here would have been about context. See? And the context that I want to connect with what you're saying is whether you're talking to engineers, children, philosophers, or whatever. And also we tend to think, coming from an industrial world, at least or the ones that grew up in Western world, we tend to believe that the whole world is like this, but it's not. There's an enormous amount of local cultures and indigenous philosophies that are very prolific, worldwide. And those voices are actually being heard much more now in the, and so that's education. So it's education talking, I would say. And if you go to talk to businessmen or engineers, the first thing I would say, and I'm actually giving a talk at the Central Bank of Iceland in October, so I'm practicing, is to say, well, you want to run an economic system. You want to have your companies working. 60 years from now, they will not be able to work. So put your people to work. And they are doing it. There are societies of business, international business organizations doing things to respond. So you use different tactics. I talk differently about biodiversity in Iceland than maybe in Brazil. Yeah, you would. So that's the context. And this is, of course, something that frightens people often to talk about context, because it seems to complicate everything, make everything so complex. But that's the beauty of it. It is complex. That's it.
I was wondering about the charr in the lava caves. Just a question about what their main predator would be inside of the system.
That's a good question. There are very, very few predators. The most important ones might be avian predators. That
Might be,
avian birds that can get into the case. Possibly mink and foxes, but they have extremely good. These areas are beautiful for hiding. So when you come to a cave like this, you see nothing. They are all under. That's why they're small. You see, they go under the lava and hide. So they are in an extremely protected environment.
And I was wondering about access to light in these areas. Does that pose any consequences on their morphology and the differences in the fish from other areas of the lake?
That's the question that we don't have a proper answer to yet, but we are strongly hypothesizing that there are in fact populations around here and elsewhere in Iceland. This could be completely in darkness, just like these amphipods that I showed you, the crabs. Because we do have examples of blind and colorless fish in caves elsewhere in the world. So I wouldn't be surprised if that is going to be discovered at one point. But light is mainly available just at the opening of the caves. And so they live a lot of their lives in darkness, sure. So they are using other senses than vision to feed, for example. Mind you, there are 30 to 40,000 species of fish. So they're extremely diverse.
very basic question.
Yeah.
How did freshwater fish get to Iceland?
Yeah, I was hoping to get questions of this kind, because the natural history is something you tend to leave out a little bit of this. And also, it's very convenient for me to assume that you've already heard this in the course. But this is you see freshwater fish that were here prior to glaciation, maybe 3 million years ago. They were able to survive to some extent in freshwater pockets, like refugia. At estuaries of rivers. So there are, for example, for the Arctic charr, this particular fish, there are well-known refugies like this, refugias like this around Iceland, Newfoundland, and northern Norway, because they have a circumpolar distribution. And you see, the thing that I didn't say about these fish is that they have the capacity to be able to spend time in seawater. So all the 5 species of fish that have come to Iceland are what we call anadromous or migratory. Atlantic salmon, Atlantic eel, threespine stickleback, brown trout, and Arctic charr. They can all be potentially migratory. So that's how they got here. They got on their own from the ocean. And but only a very few fraction of fish species actually have this ability. It also shows you that these are very special fish.
This is kind of a meta question, and it may have to just remain a rhetorical question. But you said that notions of superiority, dominance, and capitalism haven't been addressed in these kinds of conversations, and they really have to be,
Yeah.
because they're so much a part of the problem. And that we needed a biological, social, economic, and philosophical transformation to reconnect humans as natural beings. How do we do that? How do we change the behavior that has become so much a part of who we are in 20th and 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I
Right.
refer first to the answer I gave to his question a little bit, like how to educate people and
Mhm.
just bring in the dialogue. But then I think, and I'm just saying this from the top of my head, but let me give you an example. I mean, this book here, here's a scientist that I had no idea was thinking like this. I mean, this was just a guy that does mathematics with biology. And he publishes in one of the best journals of ecology, mathematical models of how biodiversity and ecosystems are connected. But he comes to the conclusion that this is the issue. And so maybe to give you another answer is to say, explain to people that we are not different from all animals. That when we have a relationship with our pet, for example, he goes into lengths describing a relationship that his family had with an owl that they inherited from the nature, young. And this owl became so attached to the family that when it got sexually mature, it actually chose him as a mate. See what I mean? And just to say that empathy and relations of that kind, and also just simply the chemicals, the needs are similar. So that's maybe a way in terms of education, and also sort of maybe using a little bit of a frightening statements like this, that your business is not going to be possible in 30 years unless you do something. So let's now start to think about circular economy. Let's think about what you really mean by sustainability.
Right.
What do you mean by ecosystem approach and resource use? We can show you data that if you continue to catch this fish at the rate you're catching it today, it will become extinct in 30 years. It's very easy to demonstrate, so please do something about it. That's exactly what Iceland did with cod fishing. And now cod fishing is in a very good shape in Iceland because there is a very strong harvest rule. We can do this.
Yeah.
And of course, the ideal thinking is that this happens somehow and becomes integrated in some harmonical way, in that we are becoming part of ecosystems. And possibly we can see that 100 years or something. But I'm just trying to be hopeful and
I know.
not
and
just
it's
say
so
it's
nice-
possible. Yeah.
It's so nice to hear it.
But what his message is, which I tend to be advertising this, I don't agree necessarily with everything he says. Or I basically would have added, I would have added a few chapters in the book, by the way. But he's deliberately writing it in a very short statement. It's only 180 pages. It's a statement. It's a manifesto. And he's very fond of philosophical ideas of things, and he talks about that a little bit. But he says, my philosophy is basically the needs of organisms and the needs of us. Needs for habitat, needs for food. So it's an instrumental value driven approach. So that when we use terms in biodiversity and ecosystem study called like terms like ecosystem service, you heard that. Then we are almost always talking about service to humans.
Right.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Services, of course, to all of the organisms. So I would say that even the most learned review articles on ecosystem service that published last year, they still define it like this.
Yeah, you shouldn't use that term.
And that's just an error. In fact, it's an ethical. It's immoral to do this. And this is what people need to understand. So we need more interpretation. We don't only, I would say, we do not only need science interpreters to explain what really going on, but we also need philosophy and sociology interpreters. So that, I mean, he makes a statement that there are like thousands of books, great philosophers and people writing big books about how to solve the problems of the world today, but almost none of it goes out into the real world.
Right. That's the problem.
Ecosystem services is an example of how economics have hijacked the language and polluted other fields of science.
That's why I asked about the difference between interaction and transaction. That's a very economic.
Economics are, up to now at least, completely anthropocentric.
Yeah.
And very dangerous area.
So when you're talking to the banks, when you're giving this pitch for the value of biodiversity, you're giving an economic argument, right? Because that's what they care about.
I will try to do that. Yes.
Yeah.
And I know that other people, they actually, what's happening at the central bank is that they are having like an environmental days, I think 1 week or two, that they call it environmental week. And they have just hired a very qualified person as a sustainability officer in Hallgrímsstaðir.
Oh yeah, yes, you know.
And I discovered through discussions with her, she's not an economist. She's a very well-rounded, very well-known young sort of person in Iceland that has been with works with sustainability and climate change. And she gave me the feeling that that they could provide me also with information about this kind of work. There is an economist also working in Iceland, Ásgeir Brynjar, who has been making these efforts to just bring in the economic consequences.
Mhm.
But if you continue this way, and we can just see it now today, I mean, we've seen the news about the climate situation in the world now. It's so dramatic. It's like heat waves and destructive weather systems left and right in the world. And it's easy for people to understand, that this is going to destroy my crop. I'm not going to be able to make any money.
Mhm.
And then it's healthy also to go back to these indigenous cultures, especially in the world today, because most indigenous cultures, at least in South America, so to take an example, are living in extremely difficult conditions, very arid situations, often been completely marginalized, like in Brazil, for example. And then they are being invaded by tourists, and but how do they cope? What can we learn from them? And there are some really interesting research going on that.
That's a tough discussion to have with a banker, right? Like,
Absolutely.
you got to sort of decenter or dethrone human beings. The anthropocentric model, well, sort of sleight of hand, making it seem advantageous to them at the same time.
I know, it's the same thing that happens when you speak with philosophers. Is that, unfortunately, I think philosophy is still burdened with anthropocentrism to a great extent.
Yeah.
But you read a text from great philosophers, and they will spend their introduction talking about that we are superior to other organisms. Okay, is that your view? Then I don't have to read anymore.
This is what I was trying to say in my opening lecture, that for economics, mainstream liberal economics, neoliberal, is completely without any connection with any living reality.
Yeah.
It's just about as well connected, no, less connected than medieval alchemy. And this is actually me at school, we have been working a little bit like a sandwich, but in between is diversity. And on my side, the cultural diversity and the environmental humanities, and on Skúli side is biological diversity. And we are working on combining and synergizing our work into something that can then be presented maybe a little bit more. But in general, there's a lot going on, and I feel that in the there's so many new ideas brewing. Younger generations are turning their backs on the anthropocentric views, etc. All these ideas about flow, agency, evolution, process philosophy. This is all really going on, and So now I'll just urge you to delve into this a little bit and include it in whatever you're doing yourselves.
But just to build a little bit on this, what Vidar just said, is that, you know, economics in that sense is based on a mechanical model of the world, for sure.
Yes.
And humans external. And science is to a great extent in the same situation. And then we always come up with these examples. There are numerous examples of these completely models and ideas that are produced by these fields that can only really be related to what you could call superstition. It's like they expect, they assume that certain things are happening, but they never question it.
Well, I was gonna say,
Yeah. Could I ask a question about that? I mean, I think that's absolutely true and very interesting, but also what's emerging is it's a question now, is there emerging these hybrid disciplines, like you know, bioeconomics or biosemiotics, or the hydrology is going into geological I mean, there's other geo, you know, this and that. So is that happening? Would that be a way of beginning to you know, work on these changes that we think are needed?
Absolutely. I think you just said it. And I would just like to just second that statement, that these connections are, I believe, like Vidar said, they are being made. I want to be optimistic in that sense. And I mentioned, I mean, the reason why I brought in this evo example, you know,
Yeah.
from us, you know, this is what it is happening in the scientific biological world through these thoughts, and you get big famous people stepping forward now and saying we need to reconnect with nature. You know, that's useful. That's very, very important. But I just want to give an example from science on this, what I call superstition. I mean, like Ásta Kristín was talking about the highlands and the magical things going on there. You know, in Iceland we say we believe in Stokkar and Steinar. We believe in the rocks and the formations and the landscapes. That's where our folklore emerges from. And of course, we believe this is to a great extent superstition, but in many ways it is an interpretation of a situation that we are connected with. But the example I want to take, which of course is a huge example and requires much more discussion, but I just want to throw it out, is the statement about genes and genetics. Remember I said about genetic blueprints? This is something that has plagued biology and is sending some people into very, very difficult avenues, and without any way out, they become trapped in the idea that a gene has an agency and does something. I mean, I get sent every day messages from multimedia about some findings in medicine or science or biodiversity, and half of them say, we just found a gene that is doing this, doing that, where this gene is not doing anything. It's just a part of a system. It's a part of a system which has its own mind, so to speak.
The gene of alcoholism, the gene of creativity, the great gene of stupidity, etc.
So that's a predictive world. That's a world that believes that everything can be predicted, that it is basically predetermined, and therefore we as superior beings, if we understand how this prediction really works, we can do whatever we want. And we can solve every problem that we want. We can cure any diseases. We can solve any problem. We can solve any social situation. Just exterminate them. Just do that. And then we will have a superior state or something like that. This is the unethical, the non-ethical view that science and economics and some philosophy is all about.